presentation has been funded and researched by work support in the Rusk College of Engineering and Technology for use in that college, other colleges at the university, as well as being shared with the Ohio Society of Professional Engineers. I've made this presentation in the Masters of Public Administration program for the City of Dublin and ultimately for the Society directly probably later this year. Thank you for the chance to be together. And I wanted to make sure we started with a common factual background or line on the Flint situation that started in seriously in 2014. But let's step back and maybe provide some context as we go and study the issue further. Number one, I think Flint is an interesting example of what happens when we impose the filter of politics over the management of human health, safety, welfare, governance, and our well-being. It also shows how politics coupled with money and budgetary issue impairs perhaps the ability to see what is right. I think thirdly, it also shows the power and outcome associated with silence and the preservation, support, or presence of silence in our actions, our processes, and the performance of our work. It also presents the issues of power and those with power versus those who do not have power in the management of their vital lives, their public health, safety, welfare, their well-being, their education, and their ability to live their lives in an effective fashion. I think as we get into the issue, we're going to see what those impacts have been in terms of choices, the accountabilities that have been imposed, and the importance ultimately of truth to power, and the importance of science and evidence still, and the criticality of that in providing truth to power. The other interesting thing I'd observe is many of the sources of the problems that were created were driven particularly by an inordinate reliance on the law, an inordinate focus on money and issues related to budget, and also, interestingly, more truth to power was being spoken in the situation as it evolved by women than necessarily the men involved in the fulfillment of vital functions in Flint, and particularly in the medical and the professional side. The number one source of public trust in the country today is the public health sector. In our country, it's the public health sector. But you'll see as we develop our discussion and review, that sector was delayed. That sector was held back. Their recommendations were not given full countenance in support. And ultimately, I think we're going to see the important gravity of choices and hard choices that we face and the escalation of those ahead and the critical role that you're going to play in managing the challenges of trade-offs and the compelling questions of trade-offs as the challenges increase, the complexities escalate, the ability to raise money or capital to address the job is limited or constrained with the passage of time, and the critical role that you're going to play in your training in terms of framing those choices, communicating them effectively, and managing the challenges or issues of trade-offs looking ahead. So with that introduction, we'll proceed deeper. Please stop, ask a question anytime you want. We'll get back on course. Try to be done at 1. Any other questions we can take at 1 at the end for those that wish to stay. But appreciate the chance to be with you, and we'll start based on the video that I think Flint represents the dire lessons in terms of public health regulatory leadership issues and some of the challenges that are raised from the regulatory leadership, engineering, communications practices, and a governance matter in terms of that case. The Flint, Michigan program only started and illustrates the fallacy of a singular focus on money and budgets, not people, service, health, nor mission, but it really started with that foundation in place and the fact that an emergency manager had been appointed by the governor to manage the economic money budget considerations in Flint. They had a challenging role of responsibility. They were managing cost cutting in a city that basically had 40% of the population below the federal poverty line. Total control over the city could be removed under the program, and local officials had no say. The emergency manager became political, socio-economic, budgetary god in terms of managing those issues. Michigan cities with emergency managers included since 2000 these cities, the percentages represent in those cities, the composition of diverse minority populations in those cities. And it was applied to municipalities, to school districts, education, and other issues associated with those cities to address a perceived and a concrete budgetary challenge that Michigan was facing. The Flint water system itself, we reviewed in summary, started in 1883, an important point when the decision was made to revert to Flint River water. The water supply had been coming through the Huron River through the Detroit water system, which is basically a system that is comprised of the city of Detroit and surrounding counties that treat and supply water and provide contract supplies of water to others in the area. The state of Michigan currently comprises 84% of the fresh water supplies in the United States. 84% of the fresh water supplies in the United States, and unfortunately they couldn't get enough water, the right place, the right supply to meet the needs of Flint in this situation. What was driving that choice in the diversion of supply from Flint, the Huron, Lake Huron to the Flint River was money and cost. Number one, the avoidance of a cost factor for continuing to purchase from the Detroit Water Supply District, and number two, a decision that was made contrary to engineering, technical, scientific input to save $100 a day by avoiding the addition of an anti-corrosion additive into the water once the decision was made to switch to the Flint River supply. What was the outcome of that? Immediate outcome was basically leaching and removal of scale that had built up on those pipes, that system that was many tens upon tens of years old, that removed the scale that had built up in a period of probably, depending upon, I guess, the input of 8 months to a year as that conversion occurred. So the water that was flowing through directly in contact to the original lead content of the pipes once that scale was removed. Damage done, water contamination, coliform bacteria appeared, corrosion in manufacturing, lead ultimately from the corrosion of pipes, and Legionnaire's disease, all the outcome of choices made at that time. Yes, sir?
Could you briefly explain why this happened? I mean, what's the difference between the Flint water and the Lake Huron water? Is that just more acidy, or why is it suddenly when they switch to this water?
I'll get a technical scientific response, and then I'll respond.
This one was untreated.
No, it's chloride concentration. So it's more corrosive because it's a higher chloride concentration, and that then is corroding and consuming that scale. It also, I think, is a little more acidic, but it's mostly that. And then that corrosion also then consumes the chlorine that they use to treat the water. And
So
that's why the Legionnaires comes up, is because it consumes all the chlorine that they're using to kill that.
So you don't get the proper chemical reactions associated with maintaining stasis and a better outcome that you had in reliance upon the Lake Huron water, which was much cleaner and less toxic than associated with the Flint River choice.
I don't have any background on the Flint River. Is there a specific reason why it's so much worse than like the Lake Huron water?
The Flint River sourcing from different sources. Secondly, had been historically the source of a lot of industrial pollution a lot of manufacturing activity in the region. Flint had a larger population at one time because it was more of an economic hub that had been reduced by 50% from the early 1960s to when this problem started up today. So it was a pattern of basically pollution from a variety of sources that ultimately created the conditions that we just discussed. Coming back then and getting back on point, the problem in a nutshell, interestingly, only occasioned a response to the business problem. The complaint from GM on water corrosion was responded to, interestingly, within 8 months, associated with what they were experiencing with corrosion on parts and materials at the production plant in Flint. But then, because of the conditions Natalie summarized, this gentleman raised, we had more water alerts appear and other issues. Low chlorine residuals appeared within the distribution system, as Natalie has pointed to, and lead started to appear in water at the tap, violating the federal standards by an order of 10-1 in terms of what was deemed acceptable as a federal standard matter. The outcome and costs in a nutshell we reviewed. It's the confluence of costs and budget driven by the power of silence. Cost and budget driven by the power of silence. As I said, we started to avoid a cost of $100 a day, $5 million a year. And we add up the cost of the direct and indirect presented in our original discussion in the slide. We're now currently managing the following cost economic outcome by the choices that were made. $1.5 billion to basically reconstruct the distribution system to remove the lead pipes due to occur by 2021 and to basically recreate the distribution system on a going forward basis. $722 million involved in pending class action lawsuits associated with claims filed for reparations, damages, and impact on a civil basis by the citizens, the customers of the choices made by the city of Flint. We add another $395 million of social costs associated with managing the 8,000 children plus who have been exposed to that lead, and lead will have a continuing impact upon those children the rest of their lives. Associated with the choice that was made. When you add that together, we're at $2.6 billion, let alone the criminal charges that are pending with 15 individuals associated with the decision-making and the political regulatory governance that was exercised over this situation, as well as the 9 people that have left their position and left their responsibilities either by resignation or by choice. Yes, Joe?
The class action suits, these are citizens who are suing the city of Flint?
They are suing, interestingly, a combination of the state, the governmental entities, and then there are other entities that have been sued, particularly advisors to the city that were part of the advisory chain in the engineering area. Veolia North America, another local regional firm, Lockwood and Associates, that provided engineering recommendations and choices that were either flawed or were deficient, and that is being litigated as well. The interesting question raised by that is, in our legal system, we have a doctrine that is called sovereign immunity, and it's extremely difficult to secure reparations and cost recovery from the sovereign, from people executing their governmental responsibilities, unless they've been gross, wanton, grossly negligent, or criminal associated with the execution of their responsibilities. So when we seek to hold accountability, there's 3 accountabilities going on here. One, suing basically because we didn't enforce the requirements of the Safe Water Drinking Act, the government, the EPA, et cetera. Secondly, criminal suits that have been filed associated with conduct that's been alleged to have been criminal gross wanton crossing the line of just mere negligent criminal intent, and settlements have been reached, and those issues are continuing to be advanced. The governor is still under investigation as an aside, with a course of conduct he and his colleagues have executed. And then finally, the civil suits, the reparations, the damages for those, the children, the citizens, the loss of economic value of their homes, the residents of Flint's thereafter. So those are the three buckets of different relief and reparations, and who's in and out of a bucket, and who has recourse, who has access to coverage or not, perhaps in the outcome of that decision-making process under our legal system. And just because it's legal doesn't necessarily mean it's safe, doesn't necessarily always mean it was healthy. Yes, Bob?
Quick aside, I wondered if the federal government had any liability associated with any of these elections.
Federal government had some responsibility in the oversight administered by EPA Region 5, associated with the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality and the exercise of their state responsibility at a regional level. Shortly thereafter, when the issue came to light, the regional administrator of Region 5 of the EPA took retirement. Again, the doctrine of sovereign immunity in terms of the exercise of monetary reparations at the federal level, the doctrine is applied there as well. Any other questions? Okay, so that's setting a little more of the context on the costs, the human toll, the economic toll, and those issues. Let's power on. And let's focus a little bit in that medical public health area. Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha was one of the voices in the wilderness, a doctor who was seeing the children come in, the elevated blood level tests, was involved at the Hurley Medical Center, who's written a book on her experiences, insights, published this summer. Brief, interesting background. That book is What the Eyes Don't See. And she is an interesting background. She's an immigrant. She came from the United Kingdom. Her parents were scientists. She became a doctor. Her parents were scientists fleeing Iraq in the period of the rule of Saddam Hussein, and came to the country, came through medical school, and worked at the Hurley Medical Center. That social impact cost is based upon study done by Columbia University. The social impacts that are going to be ingrained in the system for the next many decades to meet the needs of the 8,000 children. And she is heading up special clinics, special resources that are being assembled and being brought to bear to monitor and give extra help and support to these children as they face the lead impacts on children's citizenry summarized here. And those impacts on a health, public safety perspective are the brain damage risk. There's no acceptable safe levels of exposure to lead. The problem impacts more diverse populations in our country, long-term behavioral cultural issues, fertility issues being raised according to The Economist, and an impact on fetal deaths have been noticed already in the surrounding area. Case is important because this is illustrative of a national issue. This isn't a transactional situation. This isn't a one-off that occurred. This isn't a black swan event that occurred. The risks are increasing nationwide associated with our water. You're studying those. You're being taught those by the professors at the school, as well as in the civil engineering sector at the Rusk College. Much of the U.S. drinking water infrastructure, like Flint, is reaching the end of its useful life. That infrastructure is old. That was done and installed. The Society of Engineers, Civil Engineers, highlights that the cost to replace this is $1 trillion looking ahead, and that's on top of all the other costs and issues we're managing looking ahead. Number two, 48,000 water facilities have different levels of unsafe health risks for a variety of contaminants based upon research shown by the Environmental Working Group. Flint is a warning sign. EPA data itself shows 1,400 water systems exceeding federal lead standards. And I note, as I've noted in some of my other classes this week, The EPA has not kept up with our use of chemicals as a country. Let's put lead aside, but we haven't looked and added any new additions regarding chemicals that we're looking for in drinking water treatment since 1996. And the facts are simply that new chemicals are being introduced and produced daily, weekly, annually. Almost 90% of those chemicals have no health, environmental product analysis or declaration associated with the impact of those chemicals appearing in food packaging, materials, let alone where they ultimately leach or remove, draw water, food, or other human contact on a going forward basis. Water issues are going to be increasing in importance. Some people are taking the position that water may be the oil of the 21st century. And the management of water, the importance of water, the confluence of the availability of water because of the challenges in supply with treatment, the challenges in supply because of climate, and the availability and the costs associated with getting that supply to market. When I went to business school at Kellogg at Northwestern on an executive in early 2000 for a year, they presented 5 questions that I think are illustrative, whether we're an engineer, a businessman, or whether we're an environmental scientist. And I asked the questions here. When we look at Flint and the departments and the exercise of their governance and responsibilities, well, the choices have been different if they ask themselves 5 questions. Number 1, would it be profitable, and what about the costs? They were certainly focused on the costs. They were certainly focused on their budgetary impacts. But number 2 is, was it legal, or what they did? Some instances it's been found that it wasn't. In some instances it was legal, but legal doesn't mean it's safe. Legal doesn't mean it's necessarily the healthy outcome associated with the choice. Was it fair? Was it right? I think the history has shown now it clearly was not fair and right. And finally, was what they did sustainable? Did it have durability on the long term? Was it an expedient short-term decision, choice that was made that had little value to the mid or long term, or escalating risk and harm and exposure associated therewith? I note questions 3 and 4, fairness and rightness are subjective. The other questions have a little more objectivity associated therewith, but they're going to require wisdom. They're going to require trade-offs. They're going to require values. They're going to require harder choices than the algorithms tell me what to do. The computer told me what the proper answer should be. The objective science is telling me that this is what's occurring. But in this instance, again, we see the dynamic of power and the impact of particularly the legal, political, money functions basically stifling the value and the importance of the engineering, the scientific, the public health, the socioeconomic inputs, the education inputs that were coming from that side of the community in Flint. And ultimately, did these engineering, these choices, these political decisions foster a social good? The social good they were focused on was $100 a day. It was $5 million a year, and that's where the good stopped in that set of values, in that evaluation and horizon, compared with some of the truths, the consequences, and the costs we're having a shared discussion today. So I submit these 5 questions are always a pretty good, interesting start. The other thing, though, in your lives as you face ahead, you're going to see the dangers of the fraud quadrant starting to appear as you address these 5 questions. And what are the elements of the fraud quadrant? And I comment they might be the presence in your dynamic of pressure, and the presence of pressure in your decision-making process. Number 2, is there an opportunity to exploit? Is there an opportunity to pick winners or losers, to play favorites? And is that going to distort the quality of the decision? Number 3, the power of rationalization. The power, well, geez, you know, give me this fact or this or that, I can rationalize my way to any conclusion. And you're going to be managing that in your group. And finally, the dynamic and the pressure provided by groupthink. It's hard to be the Lone Ranger. It's hard to stand up for what's right. You may lose your job. You may lose your reputation in the short term. But that's going to be part of your trade-off. That's going to be part of your human evaluation, your professional evaluation in terms of ultimately standing for what's right. Standing and ultimately being men and women for others. And not necessarily the kind of decision-making and priorities that are either in vogue currently or the priorities that we've reviewed here today. If you have a problem, there's going to be outside resources to look to. And we're going to focus a little bit ahead here on culture. You're going to have to look to outside leadership to redirect. If you can't find it from within, you got to go from without. You need better internal oversight, better checks and balances in our systems on a going forward basis. Need better values fixed that articulate we stand for. They aren't lip service, but we live them daily in our lives. The importance of transparency, the importance of disclosure and openness to provide that balance. And finally, complexity. Complexity is not a solution. Complexity is not an answer. Increasingly, we've seen that the advent and inclusion of complexity as the solution is ultimately only perhaps the handmaiden of deception. And not necessarily a solution, but to buy time, to get to the short term. Kick the can down the road. We'll come to it later. And then finally, the increasing tools being provided by a vigilant press, a sound press, the importance of scientific communications, what you're focusing on here working with the Scripps School, and of course the power we're starting to see of social media more and more in terms of increasingly providing better balance on these issues. Flint studied the issues. Flint came back in the state, rendered their final report. The executive summary read, "The Flint water crisis is a string of government failure, intransigence, unpreparedness, delay, inaction, and environmental injustice." That's what we have concluded, the executive summary. Number two, the cost of insufficient water treatment and the choices made, I note, by commission or omission. And that's a legal concept. That's a regulatory concept. That's a code concept. Sure it is. But I submit, taking my legal hat off for a moment, the result's the same. Whether it's by commission or omission, the results, the consequences, the end result is the same. So commission or omission is interesting to study along the journey, but the results, the performance, the outcome is ultimately the same, whether it was by commission or omission or not, or whether it was by silence, and whether it was also facilitated by silence. Flint had immense toll, human life, trust, financial costs, we've talked, health, safety, and ultimately the pendency of perhaps civil and criminal liability. Lessons learned. For our environmental scientists, I'd leave you with a few. Basically, number one, poor water quality can be addressed. It's a question of will, it's a question of better science and evidence. The parties knew what to do. The engineers made recommendations to address the challenges of alkalinity, chloroform, the quality of the water they were dealing with, but they were overridden because of the costs, because basically they were talked down because of budget. In some instances, they didn't make all the right recommendations either, too. Did parties know what to do, but didn't have the will or spine to do so? Ask yourself the question constantly in what you see. Where was truth to power? Truth to power was coming in the education and in the public health sector in Flint. And it was coming from the women that were speaking out, and it wasn't coming from everybody else anointed or validated at a higher position of power or authority. In the government, in the city, in the county. So poor water quality can be addressed. There's an element of will, there's an element, we know what we need to do, we can't do it. Number two, corrosion was not understood. Gentleman's question here, I think, implies that point. Natalie's helped us on that as well. Engineering had the inputs right, but was ignored for legal, political, financial reasons. Corrosion entails the oxidation of a metal. For drinking water, the oxidant is usually oxygen and or chlorine or hypochlorite. The reductants lead, copper, or iron in the pipes at the end. The EPA rules weren't followed. The Department of Environmental Quality didn't even require a corrosion control program. in the state. Flint River was hard, that water, so they sought to soften the water, and they didn't have sufficient alkalinity in the treated water to get the outcome that was similar to the outcome they enjoyed from the Detroit water system and that authority in the Lake Huron. Focus was on microbial issues, but not enough on corrosion issues. And the chemical makeup of water has a profound impact on the integrity of pipes. That's the gentleman's question. That's Natalie's input as well to create the problem that we're managing. So corrosion was not understood. It was overlooked. It was treated as a secondary consideration. The health interface wasn't coordinated. It wasn't respected, but it wasn't even coordinated as well. It wasn't timely in every instance. There was no talking communication between MDEQ and the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. We have a continual problem with specialization and expertise in silos in this country and in this world. I repeat, we have an escalating problem with specialization, lack of integration, and silos. And it creates immense risk. It creates new risk. It creates cost. It creates consequences by the maintenance of those historical silos that have been the fabric and part of what has brought us to where we are today as a country. And some of those things have been great. Some of those things have been exceptional, but we're now starting to see that they may not be sustainable, that they may not be the best, they may not be optimal, we may not be the best we can be, and I think that needs to change. State local departments weren't coordinated. EPA, we talked, failed to exercise their leadership under the Safe Water Drinking Act in Michigan. Bottled water is recommended as a solution. What do we really feel about that? Still carried out till spring of this year. The governor announced spring 2018. Bottled water is going away. The bottle's good. The water's now good. Everybody spoke up. Everybody didn't necessarily believe that. Took a month. They still have bottled water. But it's a solid waste issue. The providers of bottled water have no legal obligation to disclose contaminants in the content of the bottled water that they're now relying upon. Chemicals can leach into water from plastics, as we know. So that solution has a new set of unintended consequences. That is a new set of issues. It's better than the old problem, but it's not an optimal optimal in terms of a permanent solution. And legal doesn't necessarily mean right, doesn't necessarily mean safe, doesn't necessarily mean the right public health or outcome. 4, organizational culture matters. It makes a difference. Michigan's culture was different. It was driven by the emergency management priorities, that program that we started our discussion on. Water service started with engineering, but culture ultimately canceled innovation, rejected proposals to improve outcomes, and compromised engineering, compromised sound science, compromised technical solutions because of the primacy of politics, because of the primacy of other priorities or values or choices that were made. Where was accountability lodged? And just because we can do something doesn't necessarily mean we should. Dan Whitliff, PE, National Society of Professional Engineers, I repeat, just because we can do something doesn't necessarily mean we ought to or should. And the public corporate behaviors are driven by finance, markets, politics, resources, budgets, without enough leadership, without enough values, without enough of the other disciplines necessary to excel or succeed. So the next lesson is stakeholders are equal to shareholders or citizenry. Is that changing? Are we getting better recognition of that? This is going to be truer, I think, and more important in the decade ahead. We're moving from financial engineering and legal cleverness, perhaps to values-based ethics that your peer group are providing. Your people are driving that shift, that priority. It's your issue to control. As people at my stage or age move on, that glass ceiling is retired. We need that in politics. We need that in governance. We need that across the board in the country. the transfer of a new optimized value system going forward. Balance is recognized as the truest goal. Profit in a dysfunctional society yields economic madness, ultimately at the end. Profit in a dysfunctional society that doesn't have consumers, doesn't have the right outcomes, only fosters madness at the end. It fosters multiple versions of Flint. It fosters multiple versions of Deepwater Horizon. It brings on the challenges raised by the conduct of Volkswagen and the management of their diesel program and their clean vehicle program looking ahead. It raises some of the challenges in governance we've seen in the state of Michigan that we've talked about here as well. Resilience comes from strong networks of relationships that you can trust, you can advise, you aren't in the silo. Employees, communities, colleagues, people in other disciplines, and everybody working together, more collaboration and more alignment, finding out what the alignment is. I submit all this junk going on, not a political statement, but a factual observation, red, blue, political party or not, we've got 66, 70% in common of what we're looking for, seeking and subscribing to, and we're all focused about the differences, all the questions around the edge. And that's not going to make us resilient, that's not going to make us greater, it's not going to make us exceptional. And the same thing exists, I think, elsewhere in the world. We're too focused because of the media communications on where we're apart and where we're different, and not enough. I submit most of us are 2/3, 3/4 of the way in alignment. Anyway, in terms of our goals, our common objectives, but we dwell and focus on that cup that's a quarter empty, rather than celebrate and enjoy that cup that's full. Confrontation of trade-offs escalates with sustainability and resilience. One of my messages, that value and importance of trade-offs ahead. Government to succeed must protect quality, avoid fatal flaw risks, sustain performance, be more durable, and promote talent access and better compliance outcomes in the next century. Political governance, we've spoken, needs more truth to power. Unresolved issues we've talked about. And finally, the legal system for accountability, we've talked about as well, is not focused and not necessarily a good solution or a good outcome. So as we approach and conclude, we can discuss hereafter, where are we going from here? What are the lessons learned, the shared experience that we have commented upon? What are the issues that loom ahead that will impact your careers, your choices, and everything you do from this day forward? In regulation, we view ethics as kind of avoiding wrongs that are distinct, and clearly the wrong type of situations. The problems is the complexity of the problems escalates the complexity of the trade-offs and the analysis and the necessity for more interdisciplinary skill, not just the engineers, not just the lawyers, not just the money people, but more interdisciplinary skill to see the blind spots, to anticipate better the consequences, to get a more fuller, a better quality outcome. To act ethically is to think beyond our own self-interest and do what is right under the circumstances. Howard Gardner noted in 5 Minds for the Future. Did we do what was right? Did we act beyond our self-interest in terms of money and budget and achieving of our political objectives? Is there an increased responsibility to manage risk more than just legally, more than just adhered to the law? And I submit there is. And I submit that's a gap, an increasingly important issue for the future. Do we have the right skills around the table? Do we have all the talents we need at the table to make the best choice? Am I blindsiding the engineers? Did I leave legal out for political reasons? I didn't bring the money people in. I didn't want to hear from public health because they're going to complain about the blood tests and what they're finding. So I cut them out of the meeting. Is that a good result? Is that where we want to be heading? Legislators should not be shifting their own public obligations to regulations and kick the can down the road by basically legislating and let the executive departments and agencies solve the real problems and make the harder choices, or give regulations or guidance that suffer from the vice of vagueness and leave you in the marketplace stuck with making those hard choices and decisions. And being recognized as a member of a profession doesn't mean the same thing as acting like a professional. If we rely on regulation, and we tend to, I think, in the academic world and even in some of our other classes, that's a problem. Let's enact a law. Let's get the regulators after them. The problem is it's only as good as the credibility of all government action. It's only as good as the enforcement viability and the resources directed to support fair, honest, good regulation. Government that fails its poor or picks shortcut solutions benefits nobody. We pick winners or losers. Government has a responsibility not to be predatory. We, as the mark of a society, the mark of a quality outcome, is how we treat our weakest links in our society, in the respect and the support we provide to the weakest links in our society. Was that done here? You can reach your own judgment and conclusions. But group selection and delineation is a human affliction. That's part of being a human. We stay in our comfort zone. We want to stay with folks that have like training. They understand my interest in water. They understand my focus in soil. I can talk to them because they're a fellow biologist. But is that enough? Is that good enough? Self-interest can be aligned with the public interest. Particularly where merit is prevailed, where the right thing is found, because then all parties will seek to improve their merits together. They'll all be working to support that right outcome. And a person who's determined to do something constructive with his or her life needs to come to terms with the fact everybody's not going to like you as you do that job. And I submit as we conclude that that choice was made by some of the people in Flint, and in some instances, it was not made. And you will face a world and issues with escalating complexity in terms of trade-offs, and to act ethically is critical to think beyond your self-interest. Can't trust your own wisdom. It's healthy to be reminded the strongest might be weak and the wisest might not necessarily make the right choices or decisions each and every time. Is Flint failure or wisdom? Because wisdom is manifest when character, values, and competence overlap. I repeat, wisdom occurs only when we have the fusion of character, values, and competency overlapping together. I don't think we had enough wisdom ultimately in Flint. And what you are is more important than what you do, your title, your money, your achievements, and your resume, ultimately. And if you don't stand for something, you're going to fall for anything. Gordon Edel observed, and I think we see clearly the results of people that ultimately didn't stand for anything, and ultimately how they've fallen. Ethics has appeared in law, it's appeared thereafter in the corporate world, appeared in the medical world. I submit it's going to be appearing more rampantly in the engineering world, in the scientific world, as we look ahead. And I conclude in recognizing that ultimately silence is not golden, because ultimately, as recognized by some that have preceded us, as this case illustrates, silence ultimately, no matter what your skill or resume, can also operate to be betrayal to those that are trusting in you, trusting in your judgment, trusting in the trade-off decisions you make, and the exercise of your personal and professional responsibilities as you go forward. So as you do so, always remember that in the practice of your developed skills as you leave the school, that you're always operating as men and women for others.